IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I am Siddharth Bhatia. Our guest today is Ramanjeet Singh Cheema, Asia Policy Director and Senior International Counsel of Access Now, which is an international non-profit organization working on human rights in the digital age. The Indian government is flexing its muscles to control the internet and social media platforms. A prolonged internet shutdown in Haryana and near Delhi and orders to Twitter to block accounts, all these speak of tougher government measures. And all these are also being closely followed by organizations such as Access Now. Where does India stand among other countries on internet restrictions? And apart from shutdowns, what else should we as citizens worry about? In today's podcast, we will find out more on this. Welcome to the Wire Talks, Raman. Okay, our interview comes in the context of recent moves by the Indian government and state governments to suppress the internet. Why is the government becoming so tough of late?
That's a good question. One can perhaps only draw conjecture that they're more worried about criticism or public commentary online. I think we've always been aware that the Modi administration across its two terms has given a lot of attention to digital discussion. It's tried to use digital tools for its outreach and for its political campaigning in general. And they may be more worried about increased criticism and concerns there. And I think you can't divorce the discussions about freedoms online from some of the discussions about freedoms offline in the physical world, with concerns about journalists, activists, protesters being targeted, a degree, I think, of a worry about intolerance and increased use of state machinery to combat political criticism or protests that they don't like. And what you're seeing now online is a clear manifestation of that, with clear steps being taken in terms of the use of current legal powers, proposals to expand and increase the number of other legal powers the government might have when it comes to online speech, expression, and communication. And also a sort of doubling down on confrontations about some of these demands publicly, whether it's with tech platforms or whether it's with individuals who have been targeted by web censorship orders or impacted by internet shutdowns.
Yeah, sure, there is a sensitivity towards criticism, but that's internally. Internationally, that cannot be stopped, right?
And I think that's the reality with which the Modi government or any government in India would have to operate, that no matter what you say, there's going to continue to be international discussion, particularly if you're worried about English language commentary, because that will continue. And there's also the famous phenomena called the Streisand effect, right? That the more you try to suppress something, the more it tends to come out there. And that's what we've seen. The government's own moves recently in terms of sending fairly problematic and then expanded takedown orders to Twitter, as well as its use of internet shutdowns, has actually increased the visibility of this problem globally. If perhaps it hadn't done this, it wouldn't have been picked up amongst the news of the Myanmar coup and the internet shutdowns there and other global developments. But by doing this, they brought the crosshairs on themselves. And I think actually as an Indian citizen and as a person who follows public policy, that's a good thing, because we do need to talk about these issues. These problems have existed in India for a while, even from the previous UPA administration into the current NDA administration. The things have been getting worse, and we need an open, honest conversation about what's going on, why it's a problem, and how we can fix it.
Speaking of Twitter, you made a good point that the more you suppress, the more these things get noticed internationally. And if you remember the first tweet by Rihanna, which got everyone hot and bothered in the government, was hashtagged about internet freedom. It pointed to a CNN story and said, why are we not talking about this? So this gets noticed more than anything else, because other issues like the protests themselves or the farm laws are a bit too complicated for people to immediately grasp. But this changed everything. So isn't that, of course, it's counterproductive, but where does this get the government?
I think what has brought the government is that front and center international attention on its use of internet shutdowns as a measure, not just to perhaps impinge internet freedom, as you mentioned, but to use it in a real world way to target dissent or protesters. And the simple other reality is that it's very easy for any commentary on that to open up that discussion, because India is right now, unfortunately, the world leader in internet shutdowns. It has been so for a while, and early trends for 2020 also showed that it's continued with that unfortunate distinction. In 2019, India was the world leader in internet shutdowns, ahead by a massive margin with over 100 shutdowns, with Yemen and, if I remember correctly, Venezuela coming with a much poorer second and third place. And what's been also a phenomena we've seen over the end of 2019 and definitely into the beginning of 2020, and now perhaps the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, has been the use of shutdowns to prevent communications to protesters. And I think it's come at a moment where there's increased international attention on this topic. And in fact, it's been happening for a while. Firstly, we must recognize that there is international consensus against internet shutdowns increasingly. That's been there in the UN, in the General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council, by many of the governments and democracies that India has key partnerships with or is friends with. And you've seen this attention about, can shutdowns be used to target protesters? For example, if you saw the Capitol Hill violence in the United States, the one thing that struck me was there's no internet shutdown there. There were consequences for some of those people who committed violence and committed crimes or have been accused of committing crimes, but there's no shutdown. And the other thing, of course, for India is that it's a new political reality with the Biden administration in power now. Even the Trump administration in the United States criticized internet shutdown in India, but obviously, as you know, in a very low-key and sporadic way. Whereas the Biden administration, even before it got elected, has said internet shutdowns are of concern, particularly in India, and they even named the Jammu and Kashmir internet shutdown. For the government, what's happened is by not engaging with that, they've had to deal with this pressure. But it's also had positive steps. And you could perhaps argue that the lifting of the internet shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir finally is a byproduct of the earlier very conservative Supreme Court judgment in the Anuradha Bhasin case at the beginning of 2020, but is also because of the tweets and international attention triggered by Rihanna, Meera Harris and others.
The government may argue that in certain cases where there is noticeable misuse of the internet, say very, very locally, to spread tension, is a good case for shutting down for that small period. But what we are seeing is a huge geographical reach, Kashmir, and really speaking in the farmers' case in Haryana, it's clearly to prevent them from communicating. So that balance has to be understood.
For sure. And see, first, I'd note that a lot of the organizations who work on internet shutdowns globally, most of whom who are members of the Keep It On coalition that Access Now anchors, our position, and that's based on considered discussion, research, and open conversation, is that internet shutdowns actually never have been established to have any value. Because if you go into this, and there's research as well from Jan Reisdak, who was at Stanford University earlier and now works with the international organization Ranking Digital Rights. Jan Reisdak's useful research was the fact that actually there is no evidence that's been provided that internet shutdowns help combat violence, counter disinformation, or prevent incitement. And in fact, the evidence, including from India, seems to be the contrary. When you shut down the internet, violence still occurs and in fact may increase because people who are committing violence may be acting with impunity because there's no visibility and attention on what they're doing. And I think that's a fact that, we in India can draw back from history, right? And if you look at 1984 and the anti-Sikh violence in Delhi, a lot of the violence was by organized actors, and the absence of media or visible communications in parts of Delhi at that point of time prevented visibility and remedy and accountability on what was happening. But Jan Reisdak also pointed out in that research that the absence of communications and even sometimes the forum for venting your outrage or concerns leads to violence instead being committed in the real world. And I think that's what's striking about the Indian discussion. The Indian government has so far provided no evidence in an organized, proper way. And compared to perhaps all the other claims that the Modi government may make, you may disagree with them, you may agree with them. But on internet shutdowns, it's never provided any conclusive evidence that they really work. They just say, damn us if you take action, but we are taking action. And this is an example of that. They've even said in Parliament, in a slightly schizophrenic way, they first said they have no data about internet shutdowns, even though communications is a federal subject where the union government, the constitution controls everything. And by the way, all telecom companies report every bit of what they do to the union government on a regular basis. But it said we don't have data. But it also said we use internet shutdowns as part of our standard operating procedure when dealing with fake news. We shut down the internet in order to combat disinformation. And you rightfully pointed out that leaving aside that stated claim, Intent shutdowns have been ordered in India for massive geographical districts. And by the way, not just for communal incitement or for preventing, preventative threats to peace and order. It's been ordered for preventing cheating in exams, for during staff selection processes, and all sorts of slightly absurd measures. And in fact, the reality we need to recognize in India at present is that intent shutdowns has become not just standard operating procedure, it's become a crutch for people in the police and public administration, whether with the union government or across state governments. And we have a problem that we need to acknowledge, that it's being used as a sort of cop-out tool, a standard part of the toolkit, even though its efficacy is not at all established and its harms are very clearly there.
Where does India stand, and what are the other examples of countries which indulge in this egregious practice?
The interesting thing is that India has actually, in the United Nations system, voted or at least not opposed resolutions that note that internet shutdowns are a violation of internationally accepted human rights principles. While it may not have given full-throated support, it at least earlier did not oppose such discussions. The unfortunate other reality, and I keep saying this is a unfortunate honor that all Indians bear, is that India is the world leader in internet shutdowns. Now, consistently over nearly 3 years, nearly over that, India has always topped the number of internet shutdowns globally in terms of shutdowns ordered in one country by different government authorities. And it's not a small difference. The country is at second or third place, which have varied. In 1 or 2 years, it was Iraq. In other years, as I mentioned, it's been Yemen and Venezuela. India is ahead by a massive margin. Our internet shutdowns tend to be at least, according to different estimates, at least around 100 shutdowns a year, whereas other countries in that list tend to be far lower. The only other place where India, in a sense, ties with other countries in the region is with Myanmar when it comes to for the duration for the longest internet shutdown, with the restrictions in Jammu and Kashmir due to blackout during the changes to Article 370 and the subsequent continuation of those restrictions, tying for a while with the internet shutdowns targeting the Rohingya and other communities in Rakhine and Chin in Myanmar. As others pointed out, India is, at least by our reckoning and by others' reckoning, an established democracy. So we also have had the dishonor of essentially having the world's longest shutdown in a democracy, which was in Jammu and Kashmir, lifted now. But as you've seen, we still order shutdowns across entire districts and states to combat protests or other developments that people in power don't like.
You've been monitoring Myanmar very closely recently. I've been reading your tweets, etc. What is the situation there?
Myanmar is quite concerning because as I mentioned previously, is that there was the fact of the continuing internet shutdown being used to potentially prevent scrutiny or to facilitate impunity against the Rohingya and other communities in Rakhine and Chin. Shutdowns that have been condemned by nearly everybody globally, but also by a large section of Myanmar civil society. And unfortunately, the NLD civilian government, in cahoots in a sense with the military, did not take action on that and allowed it to continue. And as you know, that's also been discussed in the context of the charges against Myanmar authorities on allegations of genocide at the International Court of Justice, and would also be relevant for the International Criminal Court proceeding. Now what's happened is this incredibly unfortunate development we have seen with the military coup, with the military taking over all arms and organs of the government. And what you've seen there is this odd thing. The day of the coup, they shut down the internet across Myanmar, particularly targeting mobile communications. Fixed line connectivity was still accessible. The day or two after that, they partly lifted that, and they also lifted the shutdown that is continuing in Rakhine and Chin. Less so out of concern for the people there, but because elements of the Arakan party, the political establishment there, seem to support the military. Perhaps because they had disagreements in the NLD, perhaps they wanted more power in the government. I can't say, but that happened. And the army lifted the shutdowns there. But then soon after that, we saw targeted disruption of access to Facebook Messenger, as well as WhatsApp and Instagram, basically Facebook properties in the country. And it's very important to note that it's nearly a trope that, in Myanmar, the internet is Facebook, but it's actually quite true. The majority of Myanmar's internet-connected residents access content through Facebook services. So when they blocked Facebook and WhatsApp, they blocked a large part of the communications infrastructure in the country. People jumped to Twitter. You saw Twitter then getting blocked. And interestingly, the measures taken by the Myanmar government to put pressure on some telcos and the tech used by at least one or two telecom companies resulted in Twitter being blocked as far as India. So what Myanmar did had a ripple effect to India. And it's also interesting that these two countries are significant moments of digital repression at this time. And you see this combination of the use of shutdowns, the use of web censorship powers. Myanmar, prior to the elections, in fact, blocked several news websites. was criticized for that. Even then, arrested and persecuted activists who spoke up against the shutdowns and the use of web censorship powers. That's again not in a massive way as is feared might happen in India, but it did take place. And at present today in Myanmar, you have worries about internet traffic being disrupted, which it does happen every 2 or 3 days when the military wants to prevent communications during protests or prevent visibility of protests. But you also see worry in Myanmar society around targeted surveillance. You see Myanmar groups going offline or going dark because they're worried about being monitored, about people tracking them, reporting them to the authorities or them being spied on the authorities. And they're worried that it's not just telecom companies in Myanmar who might be required to do this, that the government is directly procuring surveillance technology from companies in Israel and the West, or even perhaps in East Asia from China and elsewhere, to directly spy on them, to install malware on their devices, and to hack them in order to monitor them, as we saw in the context of NSO Pegasus in India and in many other countries.
You spoke about Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, and that brings us to the ongoing battle between Twitter and the government. First, Twitter agreed, then it unblocked the same day, and now it is standing its ground and the government is threatening arrest. Where will this lead to? I mean, now with Coup coming up, Coup being promoted actively as an alternative, do we foresee a situation where Twitter may be told, if you don't comply, get out of this country?
So I think it's for Coup as a platform, it's an odd position to be in, because I think many people are making the parallel to the United States and saying, is Coup the Parler, with Parler being the alternate microblogging service in the United States, regarded as being very friendly to the right wing, or at least that would not take active measures to censor content that is regarded as promoting incitement of violence. But I think in the parallels, besides the fact that Parler did not succeed and has actually been taken down by its own board in effect, India is also different that way, because I think for both the political parties, not just the BJP and others, but across this political spectrum, as well as for those in government, having global reach is very important to them. Being able to speak in English or even in Indian languages to Indian diaspora, as well as having other governments and the press pick up on what they're doing, is fairly critical to their strategies and their way of looking at government and communications. So they will always rely on global communication platforms. That's not going to go away. They, I think, want them to fall in line. And they were trying to do this early on rather than it build up in terms of pressure later. But also, I think there's a worry. And that's what struck me. The comments made by several spokespeople associated with the BJP as well as others, and some of the language even from the Ministry of Electronics and IT, from the IT Secretary, Mr. Ajay Sani, talks about differential treatment, first making parallels to Capitol Hill and what social media platforms did to prevent violence during the US election. But what you see well before that also is this concern that, oh, look, social media platforms, particularly Twitter, deplatformed Donald Trump and removed the right wing from these channels. And it seems to me that's actually a significant worry for them here. They may be worried that with increasing visibility and scrutiny of India, including on human rights practices, on targeted incitement against protesters, those who commit dissent, as well as minorities and ethnic communities and other vulnerable groups, that there'll be increased pressure on these services, providing space and platforms for politicians who make that possible. And that's conjecture, but that seems to be a worry that's there. The bigger issue, of course, here in India is the path is going down is that both sides are double down, but I think Twitter is also in a sense, and as I said, I'm no votary for Twitter's transparency as a platform, but what they've done categorically is essentially said, we will hold the line because what we believe you are doing is in violation of your own legal powers, the Indian constitutional framework, and what we can accept as a company. And look, it's interesting to hear that, perhaps from a company, but the reality is we actually hear that in India all the time, right? Media, newspapers, broadcast platforms in India are actually commercial entities. They have, as commercial profit-making entities, pushed back and said, what you're doing impacts our ability to operate, but also impacts larger issues around freedom of the press, around individual free speech and expression, because companies and platforms call themselves the engines of free expression. And what Twitter has essentially done is said that, yes, what you have sent to us, we've tried to comply. Some of it violates our own terms of service. And as you know, that's a problematic space because Twitter's interpretation of that and how it enforces that keeps changing. And that is of concern to, I think, nearly everybody. What Twitter said is you have used your state power, your legal power under a law passed by parliament. And looking at that and looking at what Indian courts and Indian lawmakers have said, we believe you're in violation of that. You're committing an act that's in excess of that. And we are ready to go to take consequences or go to court if we have to. And the government said, we may consider that as well. But I think it's very important that this has happened, because the reality is the way web censorship orders are being issued by the union government under the Information Technology Act, under Section 69A, the last several years, is actually unconstitutional. You see orders being issued for content that should not be blocked. As one of my friends and a well-known person in the technology policy space has said several years ago, Pranesh Prakash, who is with the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore, it is easier in India to ban text online than it is to ban books, given the legal process that we've created. It's a process that is perverse, where if, for example, tomorrow, Siddharth, you were blocked online, your Imagine podcast or your writings on a page were blocked, you would often not get notice from the union government that was happening. The orders would be secret. So if a company receives it, they may not be able to tell you easily, and they'll be taking a risk in informing you. Copies of the deliberations of the government justifying why they did that would not be made accessible to you, despite the fact that judges regard that as perverse. And if you wanted to do what the government said, right, which is take us to court if you think what we're doing is wrong, you actually wouldn't even have the paperwork to be able to do that. You'd be starting on a weak foot, and you wouldn't be able to protect and secure your rights.
Twitter's double standards occasionally make it a bit vulnerable to all this. The fact that it's standing the ground, which is notable. You rightly said it's extremely important that this has happened. The other two popular platforms like YouTube and Facebook have been a little faster on the draw in complying. But Twitter itself separately has a lot to answer for.
No, that's definitely there. The content moderation practices of a lot of big technology firms, particularly those in the US, opens up a slight complicated Pandora's box, because in reality, they are trying to take steps, including dealing with the very clear reality of today that online platforms are used to encourage violence and used to encourage other activity that can sometimes be harmful to society, not just net, but just very clearly harmful. But their practices are not clear. Their relationship with state power and authorities and what decisions they choose to take versus what comes through a legal process is not clear. And the Indian situation, in a sense, also shows that dichotomy in that problem, right? You can see clearly in their minds is this worry that, look, we can sometimes still ensure an accountability and that we're following some process. Whereas even in a democracy like India, with supposedly independent checks and balances and a democratic system and a constitution, we sometimes receive legal orders that are categorically illegal. How do you deal with it then? Our response has been to say you need to firstly be very clear, transparent on what you're doing, your practices and policies. Those policies should not just be written by Western folks in Silicon Valley. You need to actually consult with people and targeted communities globally. You need to have wide representation of people from minorities, other ethnic communities. For example, if you're taking caste discrimination up as an issue on your platform and you don't have people from scheduled caste or other disempowered communities to advise you on that, then it is a farce. And that is something that people should be asking a lot of the tech platforms about how they combat that. They have been criticized about this in the US in the context of speech targeting the African American community. They've taken steps there. But there is that consistent view that they don't do enough in other countries unless something really hits the fan, something becomes a big public issue. For example, nearly all the platforms took some steps in Myanmar after it became such a public, clear example of the Myanmar military, of Myanmar right-wing politicians using at least Facebook as a platform to directly incite violence and directly call for genocide. And after that, you saw action being taken there. But it's sort of catch up. It's sort of this discussion that if it's in the New York Times, if you're subjected to hearings in Capitol Hill in the United States, or maybe sometimes in Westminster in the UK House of Parliament, we'll take action. But we need to see them take proactive action elsewhere. And the bigger issue we do need to see is at what point of time do they choose to enforce their terms of service versus them choosing to comply with government orders. And I think that's a catch-22 for us, because we need to put pressure on them, and we simultaneously as individual citizens, as voters in the Indian Republic, need to change our legal system on this to make sure it's actually something we can say is fit for purpose and is not illegitimate, which means that we can tell Twitter that, look, we don't want you to proactively take down content. You must follow what comes to you through proper legal process in India, but we have to create that proper legal process. We right now don't have that.
quickly, you're going to have an international report out soon. So will we see some amplification of, let's say, India's rankings and some of the notes of 2020, which was a landmark year in this respect, because more and more people were using online services. So quickly, you are going to bring this out. Any highlights you want to say?
Sure. And the report will be released very soon. This will be a report from Access Now as a coordinator of the Keep It On campaign. And our initial leads from the research, unfortunately, seem to bear out that India will continue to be world number one in internet shutdowns. And it's something that's quite regrettable, but it's clearly there. And we're noting that it's been the leader for several years past. The other trend we're definitely noticing is around protests. And that shutdowns are being used more decisively to combat political demonstration than protests, and often peaceful assembly. It's not cases where it's been, violent assembly. We saw the end of 2019 and start of 2020, shutdowns being used to target CAA protesters, including ones who were peacefully assembling, not cases of where there were violence and incitement. We are noticing that there's also hyper-local shutdowns sometimes, shutdowns that take place in a small area that you can't easily confirm. That trend is growing. The other thing that I can say we are definitely seeing is also that sort of judicial resistance or judicial seizing of the issue, with not just the Supreme Court cases on Jammu and Kashmir, but also the High Court hearings across India, where the earlier cases in the Rajasthan High Court, but now cases that took place in the Guwahati High Court regarding Assam being totally under internet shutdown, where the Guwahati High Court basically cut short the internet shutdown by several days and directed the state government and telcos to restore connectivity in the middle of CAA and NRC protests. We saw the Allahabad High Court basically wrap the UP government, state government, on its knuckles and say that why is this shutdown occurring? The right to continuous internet access would seem to us to be part of the right to life and liberty under Article 21 of India's constitution. And actually, internet disruptions also impact the functioning of an independent judiciary. So we saw those sorts of trends there. But that continuing protest bit is something, as you know, towards the end of the year, we saw crop up again. And the other trend I could share, which is very concerning when it comes to India, but also South Asia, including Bangladesh, and to an extent, tips of Southeast Asia like Myanmar, is the fact that internet shutdowns took place during the pandemic at a point of time where digital technology and connectivity was even more important, where everyone agreed on its importance, from prime ministers, world leaders, the UN Secretary General, and others. And during that time, unfortunately, the Indian government, particularly in Jammu and Kashmir and elsewhere, actually conducted internet shutdowns, even as doctors and medical professionals said, we need internet connectivity. We cannot treat COVID if we cannot access PDFs of what our colleagues in other countries are doing. We need video access to know what procedures to do, what sort of diagnostics to be able to perform. And despite those pleas in India, and to an extent also in Pakistan and Bangladesh, we saw continuing internet shutdowns. And that is something very shocking that our report talks about.
What else should Indian citizens be worried about? Data protection is one thing that comes to mind. But as a citizen, as somebody who uses the internet like everybody else, not only for entertainment, but a lot of work, what else should I be worrying about?
I think it's overall, I would note two broad trends and we should be concerned by. One is the fact that, in effect, India is proving to, despite the Supreme Court's ruling on privacy being a fundamental right, and the efforts by lawmakers or expert committees to advise us on strong, robust frameworks to protect citizens' data, where actually perhaps one of the most concerning places to have data. If you see, India doesn't even have a legal requirement to report data breach. So if a data breach occurs, it's only because somebody broke the story or a company chose to go public and reveal it to people. But despite that, we have seen data breaches in India happening practically every 2 to 3 weeks, and fairly large ones, with involving millions of people's IDs and data being exposed from the private sector, leaving aside government databases, which are even more politically sensitive, and often you don't have transparency around breach occurring. But what you're seeing there is this sort of mix of the government saying, we will create a strong data protection framework, but leaving wide carve-outs for parts of the private sector, Indian companies, but even some of the lobbying of global multinationals. And more importantly, just not creating a data protection framework. India has been waiting for a data protection law now since 2008, 2009. It's striking. Even the Cambridge Analytica investigations in India, we only saw some developments a year and a half after the incident took place, with another press release saying the CBI is proceeding with its charge sheet and investigation on accused there. So you see all these breaches happening in India, occasional press statements and no accountability. And in fact, you see the government seemingly delaying the data protection process, and this is my worry, to grandfather some of these practices that you're seeing of data extraction and of data being collected and hoovered up by the private and public sectors. For example, the government seems to be rushing ahead with a health ID program and with a massive national digital health program in the absence of a data protection law, despite everyone telling it you should wait. And even if you can't wait, create a standalone health privacy law, which it hasn't done. The second trend I think that I'm very concerned by, and it's linked a bit to this data and privacy concern, this sort of national security and law and order argument to justify incredible state powers, whether to censor web content, to conduct internet shutdowns, and to allow for massively intrusive surveillance mechanisms. Remember, around 2 years ago, the Union Home Secretary allowed a massive number of additional agencies to have powers to have wiretap your data and basically to be able to tap computer communications. That is before the Supreme Court, and we have not had a hearing in the case, despite it being there. We have seen the government's own expert committees tell it that after the Puttaswamy right to privacy judgment, Indian surveillance practices where civil servants authorize them and there's no public accountability to parliament or to judges is unconstitutional, quite likely. And the government's not acted on that. There is no chapter on surveillance reform in the data protection bill. They've explicitly rejected bringing it in. And meanwhile, you see an expansion of the National Intelligence Grid project, the Central Monitoring System project. You see Parliament sanctioning it money because the government puts it in the budget, but no moves on legal oversight on those systems. And in fact, it's a regression, Siddharth, because when the Modi government first came in 2015, 2016, it said, we will pass a strong privacy law. We will consider a law on the national intelligence grid. We will do all of that. And in the second term, it's just not talking about it anymore. It talks about the privacy law, but it doesn't talk about surveillance reform at all. And it seems to be hostile to the idea that judges should oversee wiretapping, which every other democracy allows for.
So data localization is also a disguise to keep greater control of Indian data with the private and public sector. And all these laws and all these procedures are coming out, are being put into place without me being aware of them.
Yes, and in fact, that they're being rushed ahead without too much discussion or debate. Or increasingly you're seeing them say, oh, we need more powers in order to combat supposed enemies and threats. And in a sense, it sometimes reminds me of the United States right after 9/11, where that happened. And what you saw was the US passed powers that took a decade to fix and to reform. And even now, it's still like reeling under the problems from that. And as you've noted, right, what's happening is this sort of mixture of corporate interest and the interest of some of the more perhaps anti-civil liberties, although I hesitate to use that word, part of the government or, actors in the political establishment. You're seeing people who say, we need to have data in India so our companies can have a competitive advantage so they can access it. And them also saying, oh, that also makes it better for us and it helps us protect Indian user data. Although, as you know, the European Union doesn't force data to be kept only within the EU, but it says that if you're an EU resident and a company takes your data, your rights will be applied everywhere where it is. We will make sure that that remedy is there. And for example, if the US doesn't respect it, they had to tear up their data sharing agreement with the US. And it's been a complicated discussion. But you see India instead saying, oh, somehow keeping data within India would help protect people's data. Whereas most people point out, actually, it seems to be that you're doing that in order to make surveillance easier. And that might be a legitimate policy consideration, but say it. And if you're saying that at the same time, please tell us how you're modernizing Indian surveillance law, because India has surveillance practices akin to the United Kingdom in the 60s and 70s. Even the UK has changed its practices. And as you know, the UK is not a great place for surveillance. It's very fond of it. But even they have better rights and remedies for people there. So Indians who immigrated to the UK will have better protections than Indians who live here because we are operating under a legacy flawed system.
So as a citizen, what can I do to protect myself, my data, my communications, and everything?
And I say like there are three like realms of action people need to take. One, of course, is be aware of what products and services you're using. That sort of basic understanding of who are you keeping your data with, which company are you transacting with. And I know everyone clicks through the terms of service, but go through to see actually, yes, where are they based? Where is their leadership? What law is it under? And you can check. For example, Zoho, one of the largest tech firms based out of India, is actually primarily legally incorporated in the US with some incorporation here in India. Although it has an Indian as its chief executive. You want to know what practices they have, even if it reports on has there been a data breach, things like that. Secondly, you should follow digital security practices. And there are many guides to this for regular users and then for people who face particular threats. For example, if you're a journalist or a RTI, activist or a transparency worker or even perhaps a policymaker in some states in India, you're worried about surveillance conducted by bad corporate actors, by corrupt elements of the police, or even sometimes, unfortunately, as you know, by overzealous or unjustly acting members of the security and intelligence services. In that case, you should seek particular proactive guidance, and Access Now provides this for free to users at risk. Many other groups do as well in India and abroad. And you have these guides available online. You need to understand your threat mapping. Who is trying to target you in the insecure internet of today? And how can you protect yourself using, for example, encryption, two-factor authentication, one-time passwords? What apps you use to get those one-time passwords? For example, in India, since SMS can be easily intercepted, if your worry is that the local police are your threat vector for some reason, then you should be cautious about that. And those guides you access. But I'm ultimately, of course, a policy and a law person. And I come to the third element, which is that you must hold your officials and lawmakers to account. You need to press for change. And the interesting thing in India is that appetite is there. Now, nearly around 2 years ago, Access Now published a report where we looked at the discussion around digital rights in Parliament. And what we struck by was in the Indian Parliament, in terms of looking at its previous term to its new terms, you saw a massive increase in the number of questions asked about digital rights, most notably on privacy. For example, you saw that the Lok Sabha was very, very concerned about surveillance practices by government agencies, and the Rajya Sabha saw active discussion around private sector data misuse. So that appetite is there with lawmakers. You can see people in Chast, Hindi, and other Indian languages in Parliament talking about these issues, but they will only do so if you put them under pressure. Our politician serves his clients, and his clients are you and me, his constituency. So you need to speak up for that there. And India is at this moment where we can go different ways. We can choose to go a way where we better protect people's rights online, and including their rights to privacy, liberty, and freedom of speech. Or we can go down a path where we are akin to Myanmar today, to China, to Hong Kong, where, as you see, that democracy, that democratic enclave has rapidly crumbled to become a totalitarian city-state with constant chilling effect worries about people being targeted. So that's the choice before us today, and we need to act. And perhaps we need to hold the government to account. A couple of years ago, we saw the Modi government during the net neutrality campaign say, we believe in a free, open internet. We believe in privacy. After the Supreme Court judgment came out, we need to now say, what are you doing to actually do that? You need to ask state governments, whether they're Maharashtra, Karnataka, Telangana, how are you protecting our privacy? What sort of surveillance powers are you giving to the police? How many content blocking orders are you issuing? So we need to demand that change and that reform from our politicians, from our government officials.
So, Raman, that was a comprehensive overview of what's happening in this country, very disturbing, and parts of the world. And I think your role as a policy person and as a lawyer makes it more interesting because you're telling us what the policy imperatives are and how they can change. But I liked also the encouraging possibilities that a citizen could be a little more vigilant, and we need to be vigilant about protecting our privacy and our communications and really our data, because if you're going to know everything about me, then that worries me. So thank you very much. I look forward to your report, and thank you for sparing the time and talk to us. So that was a very enlightening episode about internet policy and related issues with Raman Cheema. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. let me quickly thank our sponsors on the network this week. Storytel, TheWholeTruthFoods.com, and we have a new sponsor in Syed. Thank you all so much for being part of the network. So, this is Valentine's week, and we have a bunch of stuff for you guys. So I'm going to give you a couple of episodes that you could definitely catch up with. Agla Station, Season 2, Episode 12, Be Our Valentine. Ritasha and Ayushi have a little bit of talk about love and all the rest of the stuff that goes wrong with that. On The Habit Coach, episode 396, Ashton Doctor did an episode which went into the much-debated origins of Valentine's Day. Also, do check out Candid Kannan with Siddharth Kannan featuring Govinda and his wife Sunita Ahuja. He talks to them about amazing 33 years together. But you know what, folks? If you want to hear more about these Valentine's Day things, what I suggest is go to our webpage, ivmpodcast.com/blog. And on the blog, we're going to post a bunch of different playlists that we've created for all the various major services. So if you're feeling in the mood for love, do check that out. You'll definitely enjoy it. Just a quick note on a few other noteworthy episodes this week. Nankari Kunal Vijayakar was the guest. They spoke about street food with him. On Simplified, they talk about vaccinating 1 billion people, then the logistical and administrative task in front of us. And on the Wire Talk, Siddharth talks to Devdutt Mukhopadhyay about the human cost of internet shutdowns. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Hey, I'm Zarina, your peak performance coach, leadership coach, and life coach. And I'm here to unleash that power within you with your weekly dose of mantras and empowerment. Tune in to Monday Mantras every Monday for your quick fix, and the Empowering Series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday for riveting real-life stories. You can catch us on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.